Welcome to episode 2 of the Wild Ontario podcast. We're talking to a real wood pirate out there, a guy named Adam Ruzzo. He was living the life in downtown Toronto and chose to move into the Ontario wilderness and just build an off-grid homestead from scratch from the logs on the land. No big deal. So we're talking to him about how it happened, why it happened, how he did it. A big part of the conversation is, how do you find land here in Ontario? How do you find your dream property? It's not as easy as you might think. A fascinating conversation. Folks, please support us on Patreon. You can do that at patreon.com/wildontario. You can support just at a low level, a small monthly fee, our general content production. And for higher levels of support, we've got exclusive content over there that I make just for the Patreon page. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the conversation with Adam Ruzzo on the Wild Ontario podcast, episode 2. Dude, Adam Ruzzo, welcome to the Wild Ontario podcast, my friend. Adam Ruzzo is a Wild Ontario legend. This is the guy who quit his very cool job in downtown Toronto and moved out to near Algonquin Park, bought 30 acres, built his own off-grid homestead by hand from the logs on the land. Literally, one of my heroes who's inspired me to do what my life is leading towards right now. And if you're interested in any of that kind of stuff, you got to listen to this conversation. And Adam, dude, welcome, man. Where are you?
Thank you. Hey, James. I am, if you can see behind me, I'm in Superior Country at the moment. I pulled off, there's loads of campsites along the North Shore. And this is one of them. I'm kind of like it's cottage country a little bit, so there might be some people noise going on, but mostly it's just private here. There's the lake, the big lake, as they call it, a little tiny section of it. And yeah, I'm just past Sault Ste. Marie going west right now. So that is where I'm at. It's beautiful up here. I mean, you can't go wrong in Canada. Everywhere is beautiful, really, come to learn. So this is one of the beautiful spots we have.
Absolutely, man. Except for Hamilton, dude. Hamilton is not a beautiful place, I must say. And as all people know, people from Hamilton are evil people. So we'll definitely keep it at that. But dude, the first question I've been asking everybody on the podcast is it's a very serious question, very philosophical question. If you had to be eaten alive, asshole first, by a predatory animal in Ontario, Adam Ruzzo, which animal would you choose and why?
Oh my God. That's quite the question there, James. Let's see. I'd have to go with a cougar, likely because they're more likely to attack from behind. And I just would like to know in my dying moments that they are still in Ontario and I die happy.
That's an awesome answer, dude. Oh my God. That's like you're a true conservationist. As you're being suffocated to death by the fangs of a mountain lion from behind, you have a smile on your face because mountain lion
here. They're here and I'm dead. Yeah.
Dude, that's awesome, man. I fucking love that. Dude, people literally, I started up Wild Ontario News because I shared this story about cougars being back in Ontario. And I really didn't know about that. Apparently they've kind of been quote unquote back, for 10 or 15 years. There's a bunch of people out there who believe that they never left, right? Yeah. But according to the Ministry of Natural Resources, kind of maybe 15 years ago, they started to come back. And dude, that video got like 400,000 views on Instagram. It got 700,000 views on TikTok. I'm like, wait a minute, people actually care about this stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm like, damn, people care about it's not just me and Adam Ruzzo who
right
who care about this stuff, man. So it's wild. But excellent answer, dude. So, dude, why don't you just tell people about your story, right? Undergrad and master's in music at University of Toronto. And where did you grow up? You did your degree and then you ended up, where you were working and how you got to building an off-grid homestead in Ontario.
All righty. Yes. So I had a very conventional, pretty conventional path, you could say. Whereas when I finished school, what you do next is you go to university and then you get a job like everybody else and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I was always into music, and that's kind of a bit different off the bat. So it kind of lends itself to having a different path no matter what you do, unless you want to be like a high school teacher or whatever. And none of that really ever appealed to me. So, anyways, I went off to school, U of T, got my bachelor's, got my master's degree. I was working in the city playing gigs at nice places like the Royal York Hotel and fancy restaurants and stuff like that. And basically, um, my other big passion that was always kind of there was outdoor stuff. And more than just a passion, it was kind of like every time I went north, kind of like I'm sure you feel too, you realize like, oh, so this is not the Matrix anymore. This is something totally different. This is outside the Matrix, and it's a window into a completely different way of being that's outside of the game, outside of society. You're freer. You can do what you want a bit more, and like you can kind of be your own person a lot easier. So all these things were kind of wrapped up in backcountry experiences and travel. And so I was trying to meld the two, and in the city, it just wasn't working. So basically, when I was like 25, 26, I just left the city. I just left. I quit all my jobs, and I said bye. And I've traveled up to the far north, well, semi far north, up to Yellowknife and Whitehorse. And I worked at lodges up there. I did a primitive skills apprenticeship, which kind of got me, some real good hands-on experience. And when I did that, it was in Ontario, actually. I went back to Ontario, did that. And that was like a 7 or 8 month long course. I lived in a bush shelter when I did that, and I learned flint knapping and fire making and all that sort of stuff, all the old skills. And then after that, I bought some land up by Algonquin and built myself a log cabin and lived there for about 5 years. And this is all the short version, by the way. Anyways, and then after that, so I just sold that about 2 years ago now. And I've been living out of my van, more or less, for 2 years. And in the winters, I'll rent a cabin somewhere. So this past winter, I was in kind of northern Quebec. And then before that, I was out in Nova Scotia, both times in like rural areas, cabin, wilderness sort of settings. So yeah. And right now I'm in the Sioux. And most recently, I got into working on expedition cruises. So I've been up in the Arctic most of the summer, and I just got back. So I'm now in my van again, cruising around until the next cruise happens out in Newfoundland. The next one's going to be. So that's been my life. It's so I've been trying to, meld this, keeping my feet kind of in the modern world a little bit, and then also keeping very close to reality, which is, the natural world, and more of a freer lifestyle as much as I possibly can. So that kind of gives you an idea, I hope, of my story the last couple of years, anyways, last 10 years. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, me knowing Adam pretty well, that is definitely the Coles Notes version of what has gone on, but that's a great intro, my friend. And, I'm wondering about the psyche of a young Adam Ruzzo, still a young Adam Ruzzo, but younger, in downtown Toronto. You're a guitarist, at the Fairmont Royal York, the most historic hotel in all of Canada. And life is going well. Toronto, so many, as a young single guy, lots of beautiful, high quality mates everywhere. And then all of a sudden you're like, I'm going to move into the wilderness. Like, maybe can you expand a little bit more on that? Like, it sounds like you're going to move into the bush by yourself. Did you have companionship? What was your thinking there? Like, how could you possibly leave, all the creature comforts of downtown Toronto?
Well, okay, let's see here. So I was never really a typical city guy. I've met the types, and they want nothing to do with camping and all that stuff, but I never really fit the bill for that. I grew up camping and going to a relative's cottage and stuff up close to the water, or swimming, and sleeping in tents and all that stuff. So I had my feet dipped in when I was a kid. And my grandfather lived on a farm. My mom was raised on a farm, so we'd always go visit the farm, and there was wood stoves and wood cutting and all that sort of stuff. So I was, pretty well versed in it. But when did the switch happen? Let me just think here for a sec. The switch. So when did it really happen? Yeah, I think, it was just like two different realities going on. There was the school by the book, in the box, by the rules, society sort of existence where it was like, yeah, you're going to school and you're getting geared up to be a cog in the wheel sort of thing. And then there's this totally other reality where I was going backcountry camping, and the reality out there was like, okay, yeah, you're an extension of nature. You feel solitude. You get way more in touch with the muse. You know that it's like a completely different reality. And so I was when in my early 20s, I was kind of simultaneously doing both of these things. I'd go on backcountry trips and I'd go back to school or go back to my job and back and forth. And I was like, what is going on here? And eventually I got exhausted by the working world. Even though I was doing music and stuff, it's still, you're still doing the working world. It's more or less the same thing to a large degree, being a working kind of musician. And yeah, I kind of got exhausted by it. And I was like, I'm going to try this other thing. Like, screw it. I'm just going to go for it. And that's sort of what happened. It was a gradual process. I didn't go from like Toronto one day, I go to sleep, and then the next day I go build a cabin. Like, it was a gradual thing. I went out, I traveled, I lived off the grid with all these different people. I did like workaway.com, and I checked out these different profiles, and I went out to like the prairies, BC, the far north, and I lived off the grid with these people and learned the ropes. And then I did the apprenticeship program, and then I bought the land. So, it was like a gradual process, and I kind of like was figuring it out for myself the whole time along the way. And I mean, even still at that point, it was still pretty nerve wracking. Like, you're never quite ready for it. Like, it's a big decision, obviously, to go do something like that. But another part of the reason, this is a big one too, I should always mention, is that financially it was a better move too. Because like building a cabin with the trees on the land and buying the land in cash, which for me at the time was like $21,000 or something. And then I ended up paying more for the 30 acres. I got a loan for that. But either way, it was still a lot cheaper because I had enough money for the materials and the land, basically, besides the loan. So my living expenses were really cheap. I didn't have a mortgage. And so I just didn't buy into the whole thing of like, oh, you got to have this massive mortgage and you're going to be a debt slave. Like, I just saw through all that. Books helped. I read a lot of David Suzuki books in my early 20s, which really kind of opened my eyes to the reality of Canada and how big the nature is, and the native people and how they've lived here and how they saw the world for a long time. And all these things kind of got into my psyche until the point where I basically acted on them. And I just didn't vibe with the world around me anymore. In the city, it's just not happening. So yeah.
It's amazing, man. So it wasn't like a snap and then you like, I quit, like, fuck you, boss. And like, you stormed off and you arrived into like the wilderness and you checked the MLS listings on your phone and like, I'm going to buy that land right over there. And right. That's interesting, man. I hadn't thought about that. It was a bit of a gradual process for you and learning skills. And then, actually living in the country, living in wilderness, before making that transition. That's really easy. I mean, that's really interesting. One of the things, you being a huge inspiration for my life, right? I've been sharing on my channel that, I bought this 40 acres, here on Ontario, and I want to move out there and do the off-grid homestead thing. Right. And I also want to get, I'm now at the age where like, I want to get married. I want to have kids. And one of the things I worry about, and I'm wondering if you also thought about this, is, most of the women, for example, that I know in Toronto, they're like, there's no way they would go.
I know where this is going.
Okay. Yeah.
But keep going.
There's no way that they would live on an off-grid homestead. So part of me is like, Jesus, man, if you want to get married and have kids, going to live on an off-grid homestead, it might be the really cool, guy, like geeky outdoors thing to do. But it's like, am I now narrowing down my potential mate choices by doing this? So was that a thought process for you? Like, oh my God, am I going to be like a hermit living in the woods? Or, what's going to happen? Did you go up there, by yourself, or like what was going on in terms of that whole thing?
Oh dear. All right. So yes, great question. Oh wow. So like basically, that land I bought, I had in mind to be there with somebody, but it didn't turn out to be that way. So I was dating somebody at the time, and she loved the idea. We weren't married or anything. It was like we've been dating for about a year or something, and it was kind of in the back of my mind. Okay, this could work out with the two of us and all this sort of thing. It turns out it didn't work out, and then I moved into the land alone because I had this land now, and I'm just going to do this now. So I moved in my tent, in like, was it March, and and got to work cutting down some trees, regardless, other person there or not, because here I am. I'm doing this now. I'm not just going to like let this land sit there. And then actually somebody else showed up into my life probably a few months into my whole experience there, and they ended up staying for over a year, probably a year and a bit, and helping out with the process. But then it didn't actually work out with them either. So there was a few that came and went during the time, and yeah. So I did have people there, but in the end, I left alone, and that's fine. There are people out there that are into the whole off-grid life, the country life, the rural life, raising kids out away from the city. They're out there. They're harder to find, though, for sure. They're definitely harder to find, and you're not going to find them most likely in Toronto, of all places. Though the odd one is actually in Toronto, but not in large numbers. That's definitely not happening. But for example, on like in the last couple months, I've met several ladies who live off the grid, and they're totally into the lifestyle. So there you go. They're around. You could say maybe quality over quantity. Yeah.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think for sure, especially when you're thinking about a life partner, it totally is, quality over quantity, for sure. And, my hypothesis is at first I was really worried about this, but the more I have explored the off-grid living community on the internet, the more I've realized is, man, there's actually a lot of people, male and female, even people, like you said, living in cities, that are super interested in living in the country and living on a homestead and living on an off-grid homestead. Kind of, I would call it like trad lifestyle, like trad life, traditional lifestyle kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And if I had to peg it on like percentages, I would say maybe 90% of both men and women would have no desire to do what you did or what I'm about to do at all, but 10% fucking love it. And the power of the internet is that, especially if you're sharing your life on the internet, you are going to attract people who are also attracted to the same kind of lifestyle. And actually the internet, it's a double-edged sword in many regards, but in one good regard is that it can help you connect with other people that are attracted to exactly the same kind of lifestyle that you are, right? Mm-hmm. And an interesting thing about what you said about, quality versus quantity, if you go out there and build exactly your dream life and then try to attract a partner to that, I would argue that's the optimal way of doing it, as opposed to finding someone and their dream is very different than yours, and then you both kind of water your dreams down 50% and you kind of muddle through life, right? I mean, it seems to me that a lot of people end up doing that. And is that the best thing to do? Maybe not. So I've seen what has happened with you, and that's my hypothesis currently. I'll tell you in 10 years if it's true or not. But like you said, you've been meeting a bunch of, women who are out there doing this kind of lifestyle. So all you need is one good one. And right. I think there's another saying, right? It's like, don't chase butterflies, but build a garden, right? If you build the garden, then the butterflies will come to you. And I think that's a really interesting way of, of looking at it. And, dude, there's so many people that have this fantasy, like my stepbrother and his wife. Every night before bed, there's two kind of videos they watch. The first is like bushcraft and camping videos, right? Like the Baird brothers and the Budnick brothers and, those kind of guys. And then the other kind of videos they watch are like off-grid homestead things, like Yona Yinton and Calais Floden and one of our favorite guys, another Wild Ontario legend, Sean James, right, of My Self-Reliance. Now, they live in downtown Toronto, extremely urbanized people. I don't think they have any plan of doing this themselves, but it's a dream. They watch it every night before bed. You know what I mean? It's really interesting. But dude, you mentioned about finding your land. Let's talk for a second about how does one go about finding a property to, if you want to build your own homestead, how did you find it? And like, what are your learnings of that whole process? Like, if you had to do it again, what method would you use to find land to build a homestead?
Okay, good question. Yeah. So finding land, it's a big topic because like when I first did it, I'm also in a way I'm glad I didn't know anything when I first bought land because it just forced me to buy something and then just figure it out. Uh, but there's a lot of things I didn't like about the land in the end. So it's a big question. It depends on what you want, really. Like it comes down to what you're looking for. Some people want to have a farm, like grow food. So that automatically you got to look at agriculturally where it's possible and best place to do that. Another thing, the biggest one probably is your price point. I mean, you can't buy land, you can't get a mortgage for raw land unless you have all kinds of fancy financial things in order. For most people, you have to have the cash in hand to buy the land. So if the piece of land is, $200,000, well, here's your $200,000 cash sort of thing. That's how it works. So it's price, it's what do you want to do with the land? And then it's proximity to major centers. Do you want to be like way out there, or do you want to be 15 minutes to a town, 15 minutes to a big town? Like there's all these factors, but to speak of like actually surviving and having a proper sustainable homestead for your survival needs, some things you want to look for would be southern exposure, because that's where the sun is up in the north. It's in the south of the sky. In the summertime, it really rises high and is kind of right above you, but it's usually always in the south. So south-facing slopes are your best friend for solar power or for growing food, and just for warming your house in general. Like having a lot of sunlight on your actual building helps in the wintertime. So things like that. South-facing is always like great. You want to make sure that, there's a good amount of, ideally there's varied habitat on your piece of land. If there's already a clear area that you don't have to clear the trees up to put a building, that's wonderful. So varied habitat helps. Like if there's some field and forest, that's always ideal. If there's already existing roads, that is also amazing. Even if they're not graveled, if they're just cleared, that's so great, because actually clearing a forest is so much work and money. If you already have existing roadways, and I'm talking like, you can get a vehicle on, that's like great. Or existing patches that are open, like little meadows, great. Plus forest, that's already there, great. So varied habitat is really good. So those things are like, and going with the roadways, an entrance in is also like amazing to have, because that's a lot of work. For example, when I got my land, there's no entranceway into the land. I had to buy a culvert, get a road put in there and stuff. And that was a lot of extra money and just kind of a hassle. And I couldn't park anywhere. Like when I first got there, I ended up parking at somebody else's place and I had to walk to my place, and it was kind of annoying. So an entrance in is like great. So these kind of practical things are some starting points for you. And just another note too, like depending on where you are in the world, hardwood trees or deciduous trees are better for burning wood, and they're better for, they're a better vibe in the woods because there's, less risk of forest fire. Birds tend to favor them a bit more. It kind of makes for a nice, just a nicer feeling in there. The soil's usually better with those trees. And if you're getting like all conifer trees, it's great too. They're great for building things. They've got great round logs. You can still burn them. They're not as nice to burn. And the soil is usually more acidic in areas like that. So those are just some basics right there I would suggest to people if they ask me. Yeah.
Those are excellent points, dude, especially the south-facing slope. I remember I sent you a listing and you're like, yeah, dude, it looks really cool. But it was like a 200-acre, property that I think was selling for 120 grand, but the seller was willing to finance, like mortgage-backed finance, half the value. So you only need to have 60 grand in cash. And you're like, yeah, that's a really cool property, dude. Big problem. It's literally it's a north-facing slope, the entire property. And you're like, dude, you're gonna have big problems with that. You might not remember this, but I was like, sage advice, bro, sage advice. Because I was like, man, this is dream property, right? It was such a cool thing.
Careful out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think you brought up a very interesting point about
Oh,
deciduous. Go ahead.
one more. Sorry. High and dry is another one too. You want to remember just that saying, high and dry. Like, uh, there's a lot of people that try and sell land and it's just like swampy or north facing slopes. And they don't say that in the listing, right? They're counting on people who don't know what they're doing to pick it up. But you don't want low lying land. You want higher. Higher is better. So elevation is nice because there's less flooding issues and, you know, yeah, that's really the main thing. You do, and it's less buggy. It's more breeze. All these things really add up. So just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Excellent point, man. Yeah, I've got a horror story about swampiness. By the way, I'll tell you in a second. I think I told you about this one property that I drove 8 hours to discover it was entirely swamp. But yeah, the thing about deciduous and coniferous trees, a lot of people think that all of Ontario kind of looks the same, especially people from Southern Ontario. They just imagine that from here up to Moose Factory on James Bay, it all kind of looks the same, right? There's some kind of, there's oak trees and pine trees and, all this stuff, but no, baby, it's like the climate zones. So, the far south, Windsor to basically Hamilton's climate zone 7. Most of Southern Ontario is kind of climate zone 6. Then climate zone 5, I would say, is kind of like, the north part of, maybe in and around Lake Simcoe, a band kind of to the east and the west. And the key thing to remember, I think, is above that's climate zone 4, which is most of central Ontario, including maybe even where you are right now, the north shore of Lake Huron over to Sault Ste. Marie. But once you get into climate zone 3, the hardwood trees disappear. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you are a person, I think, such as yourself and myself, who love hardwood trees for many different reasons, maybe because we're soft Southerners, as someone from Thunder Bay would probably say, we don't need no hardwood trees, you Southern pussy, right? They might say something like that. But if you like hardwoods, you're not going to find it pretty much like, I would say, starting in Wawa to the north. You really got to look at climatic zone maps of Ontario to understand the key, I think, inflection point in Ontario is climate zone 4 into 3, because 3 is really where the boreal forest starts. And that's where you have, it's jack pine and poplar and spruce and birch. And there's no hardwoods, right? Like, I think that's really critical for people to remember. And dude, talk to me about what websites were you using to search for land, and what did you use in your process versus like how would you do it now in terms of like the real estate searching architecture out there?
Sure. One last point on the land too, and I'll get to that question. Is yeah, how much space do you need? Because there's this like special 100-acre thing that's burned in everybody's brains, like, because all the land was originally set up in 100-acre parcels all over the place, and it's a nice number, sure, like 100 acres, that sounds great, but in my opinion, you don't need nearly that much. Even 30 acres for me was plenty, like it's tons of land. If you're in an area with a lot of crown land, that you can use at any time, and if your land abuts that crown land, 5 acres, 10 acres, that's so much land, I mean, in my opinion. So I think people should actually walk the properties and get a feel for what 100 acres actually feels like. It's massive. It's immense. Like, you'll never see the whole thing on a regular basis anyways. Like, so just want to put that out there. My number right now, I'm thinking like if I go through it again, probably 10. 10 would be great. Anything more is a bonus. Anyways, 40 is great. I know you got
To
40
that
acres.
point too, Adam, to that point too, I remember at one point you mentioning to me 25 acres if you want to be sustainably harvesting wood over time for both construction, but also for firewood, if that is your objective, to also be able to harvest 100% of your wood needs from your own property. You said the key number there from your research was 25 acres, right? So where you're harvesting, the wood can naturally regenerate itself by the time you're harvesting more. Do you still think that 25, and I understand what you said about the 5 to 10 acres is totally enough, especially if you've got crown land, for living, but in terms of that wood harvesting regeneration number, do you still believe that 25 acres is the minimum sustainable size?
Yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. If you have 25 acres of forest, that's forested, you can indefinitely harvest. If and you're heating a house, that's insulated and all that stuff. Like a modern house that's insulated and you're heating it with wood. Yeah, I think that's plenty of land to sustainably to use. There's it's amazing. The forest is incredible, and I mean, like, there's so many different ways to cut a tree here and there and let the whole thing thrive. And yeah, I mean, even in my case, I had a smaller place. It was like 650 square feet, log cabin. It was insulated and all that. I was cutting like maybe, I forget the amount of wood, maybe 8 to 10 cords per year of wood. Most of it was softwood. I know I was just saying hardwood's better to burn, but I was burning a lot of softwood in there. And yeah, I was always like overflowing. I couldn't keep up with the amount of trees that had to be taken down on my 30-ish acres. Like, it was just never ending. And the stuff that fell naturally, and like, if you're doing a careful job, 25 acres, in my opinion, is plenty to use. Yeah.
Quick break from the podcast, everybody. If you want to support us in the production of this content, go to patreon.com/wildontario. For only $5 a month, you can support us in our production of this content, as well as get exclusive content that I'm making just for our Patreon page. Check it out, patreon.com/wildontario. Now back to the podcast. That's really interesting, man, because I remember posting a little bit of, a few stories about my 40 acres that I purchased, and so many people in the comments, to your point about the 100-acre magic mark, is like, so many people is like, oh, that's the dream, bro. Just, me and my wife, we're going to find our 100 acres out in, the country and build our own homestead. Everyone's got that 100-acre mark in their mind. And it's like people, like, do you realize how big 100 acres is? Like, that's a lot of land, especially, we're going to get into this in a second. I think about economics in terms of, it's like most vacant land, you can't finance it. You're going to have to pay 100% cash for it. So 100 acres is a lot of land, especially if you're buying that in central Ontario, anywhere south, basically the French River and North Bay and Sudbury, but yeah, man, that's really interesting. What about the websites, man? What websites were you using to do your land search? What was reliable? What wasted your time? How would you do it now if you had to do it over again?
Yeah, so I know you use this one, recreationland.net, I'm pretty sure it's called. That's the mostly Ontario. I think it's all Ontario off-grid properties. It's a great resource. And then beyond that was my main one for like dreaming. And then I would look up like Realtor. Is it the realtor.ca app is good for finding land? There's that one too. But really the best thing to do, like, so again, here's this massive gap in like realities. There's the looking at the listings and actually, and I should mention Kijiji is great too. Kijiji is awesome for finding little gems. So those are my 3 for looking at land. Realtor.ca is super conventional. Everyone probably looks at land that way. But yeah, the big gap is like, a lot of the times, and I think you've experienced this too, when you go to small areas and you get to know the people, you hear about all these other ones that are for sale all of a sudden. And you hear about people that had all this land and maybe they didn't even think about selling it until they met you. And they're like, oh, you're looking for land? Well, yeah, maybe I could sever you off something. Like, there's all kinds of stuff like that. So the reality is very different on paper than when you're actually in a rural area or an area with loads of like hunting properties around. The best thing to do, really, if you're willing and brave enough to go do it, is like just go to a place you're interested in living and get talking to the locals, get to know the locals and ask that way. Because then you'll hear about all kinds of other stuff that's usually like a more reasonable price as well. So that's probably the best way to get a good deal on land, I would say.
Very interesting, man. Yeah, because that's what happened with me, right?
Yeah, right.
I found out about this area. My stepbrother sent me this listing in this area in central Ontario. And wow, I'm like, this is a really cool property. It was from recreationland.net. And I'm like, this is really cool. And I went to drive up there to look at it. And I didn't end up buying that property. But I'm like, I love this area. I met a bunch of the locals. And I think about, I guess 6 months later, I ended up buying a property that was just through word of mouth that was not even ever listed, right? It's just one of the neighbors is like, hey, this guy was wanting to sell his land. He's moving back over to Europe. And that's the property I ended up buying. So like you said, if you zero in on a cool spot, get to know the locals. What I did is every time I ended up doing, so to this one area, I ended up going there, oh my God, 4 times. I did 4 trips up there. And each time I literally brought 10 bags of coffee and 10 bags of oatmeal. And, I think don't underestimate the power of a small unexpected gift when you're meeting new people, because listen, a bag of organic oatmeal, a bag of organic coffee, it costs they're like $10 each. And I literally gifted that to every neighbor. I would just drive up a driveway and see if somebody was home. And some people told me, it's like, hey, fuck off, and then most people, 80% of people were like, hey, who are you? It's like, would love to talk to you. And you give them that. And then all of a sudden that opens up doors and they're like, yo, this is a nice, because I think humans track reciprocity very, very closely. And that's from, our ancient hunter-gatherer times, right? Like if you give part of your deer meat to a person, you really track, like at the next time, if they get a deer and I don't, is this person giving me deer meat back? Because if they don't, I'm not going to share my hunt with this person in the future, right? So I think those kind of little gifts, if you're in an area, can make a huge difference, because everybody eats oatmeal and coffee pretty much, right?
Yeah.
But
good idea.
Yeah. And, a warning about some of these rural land listings that you may have some interesting stories about. I know you have some interesting stories because you told them to me, man. So with this listing that I saw on recreationland.net, full disclosure, I still love the platform, but recreationland.net, apparently 90% of the transactions on that website, and there's other websites out there, right? Another one's called ontarioland.com. Is a similar one run out of Thunder Bay, and it specializes in rural vacant land properties throughout Ontario, mainly in central and northern Ontario. But a lot of these properties, the buyers never see them before they buy it. 90%, that's what these realtors are claiming. And also the realtors themselves never actually see the properties because they're dealing with such a huge volume of properties spread everywhere across the province. They are reliant on the sellers of the property to provide the information about the property. So in this situation, this listing that my stepbrother sent to me, the pictures of the property were actually pictures of the adjacent property, not the property itself. So when I got there, dude, I was expecting this one beautiful meadow, lots of trees. And when I got out there into the property, I'm like, dude, the thing is 100% flooded swamp. Like it had a very nice creek that flowed right through the middle of the 40 acres. It was entirely flooded. I walked all the 4 corners of it. And also the access, the seller had lied about the access. There was they said, you could walk across the 2 neighbors' land to the south. And both the neighbors to the south were like, who are you? Like, get the fuck out of here. Like you can't walk across my land. Right. Because I think to them also, like they want to preserve their privacy. They don't want someone buying this lot that's in behind them and then, having to deal with a new neighbor and that kind of stuff. So I had to literally do this like 3-hour epic march in through the crown land to the north, which I was not expecting. And only to discover the entire thing is swamp. I'm like, I drove 8 fucking hours
Yeah.
to look at a swamp. And I called the realtor and I was pissed off at him. But, I very quickly realized, like, listen, these realtors don't look at the listings. Like, it's not the realtor's fault. It's the seller's fault that because they don't have like, dude, Ontario is fucking huge. It's bigger than Texas combined. It's bigger than the country of France. Like these realtors don't have time to check out all these rural properties on these high volume rural land websites. Right. So I think whether it's MLS or it's recreationland.net or ontarioland.com, you really got to check out the property yourself. Do not buy it sight unseen, despite the fact 90% of people are doing it. And the other piece of advice I would add on to that is sleep on your property overnight, which I think you might concur with this, because in the country, you never know if there's a mine, if there's a sawmill, if the guy next door all of a sudden starts playing his banjo every night at 2 a.m., you just got to know, because even if you're buying 100 acres, sound travels. You need to know what's going on. You need to sleep overnight. And I did this on every property that I was serious about. I camped out overnight on the property, or if I didn't have permission, on the crown land nearby to ascertain what is the situation, right? So, what do you expand on those, ideas and experiences? I remember a story you told me about getting up to a property maybe near Thunder Bay, and there was literally a giant mine like down
Yeah.
the road. So expand on this, man. What do you need to look out for with rural land,
Yeah.
listings?
Yeah, such a good point. I should also mention I'm having a typical off-grid issue come up here where my phone is dying. So this might be my last couple points. We'll have to do a part two.
Okay.
Uh, but yes, noise is number one. Get away from the highways. Two lane highways. Excuse me. Noise travels more through the trees. In the winter, it's bouncier. Like when it's not a fresh snowfall, that is. But like it's through the seasons, it changes and it's loud out there. You can hear things more clearly, especially when cars, like in the city, we're used to cars going like 40 and they don't make much noise. But when cars go 80 or 100, they make a lot of noise. And when they go up hills, they rev up more. Like, so you want to get away from highways if you can, because if you're seeking like true quiet. In the woods, there's a lot of industry. There's the noisiest ones are, yeah, sawmills, mines, and snowmobiles slash ATVs. If you're by a snowmobile or ATV trail, you're gonna hear that a lot, and they are way louder than cars. Both of those things, they're really annoying, to be honest. So if you're looking for true peace and quiet, you want to avoid like major recreational trails, because people out in the country, they're going to use them, and they're going to bring all their stuff out there all times of the year. So there's that. My place was near a sawmill at the crack of dawn. This is a big mistake. Part of the reason I didn't like my land in the end. At the crack of dawn, I heard the saw get started and the logs get cut and fall into like a big truck every morning. Like, and if it was dewy, you know how like sound travels on a lake? If the air is more humid and it's foggy, well, all those water droplets act like a lake in the atmosphere, and it's just like the sound is right there. It's crazy. And the sawmill was only a kilometer away, so it's far enough on certain windy summer days, but on other days it was I could hear it so loudly. So yeah, and then neighbors too. Out in the country, everybody's got a chainsaw, a riding lawnmower, a tractor, a couple of vehicles, dogs. So all these things are, again, really annoying. And when people think of living out in the woods or out in the country, they think, the birds and wind and the waves. But in reality, if you have everybody, even people that are pretty spaced out along a, dirt road or a 2-lane highway, you're going to hear everything going on. So 100 acres, which is a number we were throwing around before, is great if it's one direction, if it's a thin rectangle. But if you've got like people and they're 100-acre parcels and you're all like 100 feet away from each other and then across the road from each other, and people are shooting their guns off for target practice, like these are the kinds of things you're going to hear: guns, dogs, ATVs, snowmobiles, industry, highways, like riding lawnmowers. My biggest pet peeve are the riding lawnmowers, because that's the last thing you want to smell is fresh cut grass, and the last thing you want to hear in the woods is somebody riding their lawnmower, and their lawn is 30 acres large in size. So all these things are issues in the country when you're talking about location and sounds and all that stuff. And then yeah, you mentioned neighbors. Speaking of the neighbor issues, one piece of land I looked at in Cape Breton a little while ago, what was the neighbor had aggressively spray painted all kinds of property markers on the land I was looking at. So there was a massive neighbor conflict there with who owns what, and so I obviously stayed away from that. I was just kind of browsing around at the time. This was like 2 years ago now, but yeah, you want to look out for like property lines. Another thing to ask for while we're talking about it. Oops. Sorry if I got cut off there. There we go. Another thing to look out for is like survey markers. This is a big one. Is your land surveyed? I should have mentioned this earlier, because if it's not, there might be some property line conflicts, because what your neighbor says might be different from what the listing says. And usually your neighbor wins. That's just how it works. So there's that. And also, to get your land surveyed is expensive. It's like, I heard one number, I'm not sure how accurate this is now, but per line, it's like $7,000 or $8,000 to do like one line of your property with some guy with a chainsaw and a GPS and property stakes and all that stuff. So if you got to do,
My mother just did our family cottage, and it was
yeah,
$5,000 for the whole thing. And the
okay,
acreage, I believe, on the family cottage is 20 acres.
okay,
So that is the most recent number that I heard. But it also may depend on your geographic location, right? The more remote you are, if the more travel time, that could
yeah,
affect that too, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. You're right.
yeah, yeah. That's all that stuff is important to keep in mind. Yeah. But good to know. Yeah, it's expensive. It's not cheap. So if you have it already surveyed, that's like a huge bonus. And when you're walking the land, look for the markers. Look for the old survey markers. They're super important, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, man, that's really sage advice. I can't overstate the importance of having a good GPS software that has the data for private land and crown land parcels in Ontario when you're looking for rural land. I had this app called Hunt Stand, and there's another app called OnX Hunt. These are two hunting apps primarily, but anybody can use them because they've got great. I think there's other, like ArcGIS is another one that real estate agents use, but you can see all the private property and crown land lines in the entire province. And you can also see your position on them. It's like Google Maps with an overlay of where the private property lines are. So when you're looking at a property, you can literally see exactly where you are compared to the government data on where the boundaries are. Now, there
Smart.
might be little discrepancies in terms of if you have a professional engineering team come out and do a survey on your property, but directionally, I think that the government, because they get all this data from the government, right? The government data is going to be 95% directionally correct. Would I rely on that when I'm building a driveway into my new place? Just by eyeballing this little GPS program on my phone, and you're near a border with a neighbor? No, I wouldn't, right? I would want to have
Right.
that survey done because you don't want Jimmy next door hunt you down with a shotgun because your driveway is 50% on his property, right? Because that could cause a lot of problems. But in terms of at least scouting properties, I cannot state enough the importance of having an app like that. I think Hunt Stand is $39. I have to be careful when I say Hunt Stand really quick, because for some reason I sometimes say it with a C, and it sounds like cunt stand, and I'm like, Jesus. So I have to be very careful when I'm like Hunt Stand, because it can sound like cunt stand, right? But anyways, I think Onyx Hunt is a similar price. Because did you have a software like that when you were scouting?
No, no, I just looked for property markers once I was clued into it.
Because
And luckily I found them. But I did have some other, I think I was using Ontario Crown Land Use Policy Atlas to see the property lines. It has something similar on there. That's what I was using, but it was very rough, very rough. Yeah.
Because that's what I was using before, because these apps are not very old, right? I think these apps, in terms of their availability in Canada, I think they've only been around for about 12 or 16 months. So they're kind of a newish thing, but like for people that are looking, oh my God, it's so helpful. It's so helpful to know, right? I remember looking at one property with this old timer, this 80-year-old guy who was a retired forestry guy. And he was just kind of like, well, I remember the property. He's like, it kind of starts here, and then it's 10 steps to the right, and then it goes off on approximately a 45-degree angle. And it was like a 70-acre property. And I'm just like, dude, I'm sorry, but this is not really helpful. Because I actually had the app in my hand, and he's like, oh, I don't trust that Google bullshit. He's like, it's a bunch of shit. He's like, I remember, starts here, 45-degree angle. I'm like, okay, man. I'm like, it's your property, man. Like, I went along with it, but I was looking at my app, while we were walking his property.
This is the reality. This is a reality. Another reality is my phone is dying, and I have no way to charge it because I'm using my headphones. This is first world problems.
Let's just keep going, man, until it's literally dead, and then I'll just kind of sign off, because this is a great first episode just on like basically, how do you find land? Because I think so many people are don't have any idea, right?
It's very different, and usually, if they're totally new to it, just email the listing agent and they'll just say, oh yeah, just walk the property, just walk the property. That's the kind of the lingo they use, which means you just drive there and just walk it. If it's vacant and nobody's there, you can just go look at it whenever you want, basically. and sleep
Absolutely.
on it even. I don't know if that's allowed, but it's a good idea still.
Absolutely, man. I mean, yeah, like, I remember talking to one landowner and I was like, hey, like, can I sleep on the property overnight? And it was a family selling the property, right? With like four brothers and sisters. And they're like,
Ah,
yeah, like one of our sisters is not cool with that from like a liability perspective. And these are people who live in Toronto, and this property was like 6 hours from Toronto. Dude,
okay.
it was a 20-acre property. I fucking slept on it anyways, right? I'm like,
Fair enough.
really? Are you going to end up in a a Soviet gulag for doing that? I don't think so. Play it by ear, but it's really
Mhm.
important to scope it out, overnight, right?
Yeah, for sure. This is reminding me too. There's a great app. It's like Airbnb, but for just vacant land or like camping. It's called Hip Camp. I don't know if
Mm,
you've heard of this, but it's one way to actually get around and like just get a feel for different areas. Like if there's a property in an area you're thinking about on Hip Camp, it's like sometimes it's as cheap as like 15-20 bucks to just camp there for a night. Uh, and it's worth doing, just to get a feel for the area there's just another option you can take if you're thinking about all this stuff. Worth
yeah,
mentioning.
hip
Yeah.
camp.
Hip
It,
camp. Yeah, it's cool. I've used it before. Been on the road in my van. I don't know an area and I got to find a spot and there's no places around. Go on Hip Camp. It's like 20 bucks. You pull into somebody's vacant property and it's big fire pit there, places to camp everywhere. It's like 3 acres big to yourself, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay, that's another interesting tool there, man. That's good to know.
Mhm.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
What do you think about financing? Because this is one of the things I learned from you is that, it makes a big difference to people in terms of affordability. The realization that most crown land in Canada, and this is very different than the United States, most rural vacant land where there's no structure on it, you have to pay 100% in cash. The big banks will not finance it, right? Um,
Right.
so my land, I had to buy in cash, 100%
Mhm.
cash. It really limits, what you can afford. I ran into a fellow recently who's got 100 acres near Bancroft, and he was able to find a small rural focused private lender who lent him, I believe he put 50% cash down. He got 50% financing, but I think his rate was like double prime. So the rates aren't great out
Yeah.
there. They're going to charge you a lot of money. I think it still makes sense, with rural land in Ontario to pay cash if you can. But
Yeah.
you were also in a unique situation because, correct me if I'm wrong, you bought like 1 acre in cash first, and then you bought the additional 30 or 29 acres beside, and you were able to get a line of credit based on your salary that you were earning in Toronto. Is that correct? Or your overall just financial health, I believe, which may be a tool for some people who are like, if you're employed by a big company, you can get a line of credit based on your income. But maybe speak a little bit to that, like the financing situation in Ontario for rural land.
Yeah. So basically everything you said is like 100% bang on. Uh, yeah, the best way to do it is through a private lender. Uh, that's really the best option. That's exactly what I did actually. I found somebody who was willing to loan at a higher rate. So that's the route I went. I think I put like around 50% down or like something like that on the rest of the land that I bought. And they gave it to me at a higher rate. So it was more interest. But because it was such low numbers, it wasn't a huge deal in the end, to do that. So yeah, but you mentioned if there's no structure, you have to pay cash. But even if there is a structure, like if there's a shed or if there's an off-grid cabin that's not attached to the grid, that's considered vacant land still by the bank standards. Even if there's a beautiful place there that's not attached to the grid and it doesn't have a septic, say it's a composting toilet or an outhouse, no, that doesn't count either. So it
How
has
does
to be
that
like,
I was under the impression that the guy that bought your 30 acres, your property and your cabin from you, because you built this beautiful, we probably won't even be able to get into on this episode, this beautiful cabin, 10 by 22 feet, I believe, with like additions onto it. There was a half story on a loft on top. You have fully, electric, solar power, all that kind of stuff. Wait, so how did the guy buy it with fine? I was under the impression he got like a loan from one of the big banks to buy that, or is that not correct?
no, I'm pretty sure he paid, yeah, well, he actually, yeah, he did. I got cash for it. Yeah. Um, quite sure that was the situation with him. I was waiting for that, unicorn type buyer because I had to sell it and say in the listing, like, you can't get a mortgage for this place. This has to be a cash sale. And a lot of people were super interested. And then once they saw that, they're like, oh, never mind. And then from all those people, there was probably like 5 viewings of the cabin and the property. And then in the end, one was able to do it with cash, and I ended up selling it. So that's how that worked. But it took a while, and yeah, it's harder obviously because people don't have loads of cash lying around. Usually they finance everything. So that's how it worked though. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think this changes the people just assume you could, because in the States, I literally have a friend who's looking at buying land in Kentucky. And in Kentucky, you can buy rural land with no structure on it for starting at 3% cash down, which totally changes the calculus in terms of what you can do in terms of actualizing your dreams, right? So
Kentucky off grid. Here we go. Here we go.
Kentucky off grid to, Copperhead Road, let's brew some bourbon and grow marijuana off grid in Kentucky, baby. But it makes a huge difference in what you can do here, in Ontario. Yeah, wow, man, that's super interesting. To know about the financing situation. Let's talk for a second about floodplains and swamps, because I found a property that I loved. It was 25 acres. It was landlocked, but the neighbor to the south of the property was willing to split me off, essentially like call it a quarter acre, so that I could build a driveway in from the road to the property and then have access to it. And it was this really unique situation where the seller was not really interested in trying to unlock his own land. So I was able to buy it for like $500 an acre, which is ridiculous. And if I was able to buy this land from the guy to the south, he would be willing to, I think he was willing to sell it to me for like $1,000, which is nuts, because as soon as I was able to connect that land to the road, this land that I was essentially buying for like $12,000 would, if you looked at the similar listings in the area, a 20-acre property like that connected to the road would easily be worth $100,000. So I thought, like, look at me, budding, real estate baron right here. I'm going to turn, 15 grand into $100,000 like a snap of a finger. And then after working with the local township, a bunch of back and forth over like 3 months. And they're like, listen, to our knowledge, that entire property is in a floodplain. And in reality, they didn't have any accurate data on that area. It was just like an eyeball guess from the planner. And they're like, we are not allowing you to sever the land. You can't sever a lot that is in a floodplain for whatever reason. And I was like, no, like, because the land was, so part of the land was flooded, but the other part, there was like, I'd say a 10-foot embankment up to the high and dry portion of it. And the rest was high and dry. But I'm like, it couldn't go through. I couldn't sever the land and buy that property because it was technically in a floodplain. So in Ontario, whether you're unorganized or organized township, when you're severing lots to try to, even like you meet someone and they're willing to sever their lot for you, or you're severing a lot to try to gain access to something that might be difficult access because you have to go through Crown land to get to it, or it's completely landlocked like this parcel, you have to be aware of the zoning issues around this kind of stuff, right? Which is really interesting. Maybe you could expand on that idea, and then also maybe talk a little bit about, what's the difference between, why do people need to be concerned about organized versus unorganized townships when looking for rural land in Ontario?
Right. So floodplains, don't have a ton of experience with floodplains proper. The only thing I can say is one property I've looked at in the past had a.
And we have lost Mr. Adam Ruzzo. Oh my God. I think he may have been taken out by a mountain lion, ladies and gentlemen, but that was his wish, right? He wanted to get taken out by a mountain lion. It is proving that conservation is working here in Ontario. So I guess I'll just finish off this story. We're going to have Adam on again, but finish off this story about, searching for rural land in Ontario. I'm trying to think of what else there is to be cognizant of. That financing piece was key. Working with your local township is key. I guess the last part is organized versus unorganized townships. I would say almost all of the townships south of the French River and Lake Nipissing in Ontario are now organized. Adam was in a very unique situation where he bought his 30 acres not far from Bancroft, just south of Algonquin Park, in an unorganized township, which means there's no mayor, there's no town council, there's basically no rules in an unorganized township other than the provincial building rules. There's some rules around, how to build septic tanks, how to build an outhouse. There's some basic things there, but there's basically no rules. So he could build his cabin without a building permit, and he did all the wiring himself. Nothing had to be necessarily to onerous spec. A lot of building permits in most organized townships can easily be $5,000 or $6,000 for the permit, and then money on top of that per square foot. So it really changes the game. And some townships are more anal than others about how, difficult they're going to be on giving you a permit to build a structure that you want. So a lot of people who are doing off-grid homesteads, like the one that Adam did, they look for unorganized townships. So in Adam's situation, he lucked out because literally as soon as he finished building his cabin, his township incorporated itself. It got a mayor, it got a township. Basically, the population got to a level where it could become organized with the tax base they were able to afford, an actual city, a township government structure. So he was lucky because he got his building in right before then. Otherwise, if he had tried to build there and it was an organized township, he would have needed a building permit. He would have probably need to hire professional contractors and or plumbers and electricians to make sure that all the work that he was doing actually met the building codes. So that's something really to keep in mind. Once you start to get north of the French River and Lake Nipissing, that's where there's big swaths of the province that are unorganized townships. And a lot of those places are sometimes there's even a premium now on properties that are in unorganized townships because the off-grid homestead community will try to buy up land in that area. It's preferred. So my land that I bought is in an unorganized township. I really like that. One of the famous locations that I found for unorganized townships was called Nalalu, which is essentially an area, and there's other kind of areas to it, parts to it, but the Nalalu area is just the southwest of the city of Thunder Bay. It's kind of between Thunder Bay and the U.S. border. It's a big geographic area. It's almost all unorganized townships. The Woolly Steer Ranch, who I've made a video about on my Instagram and TikTok page for Wild Ontario, that's where their ranch is based. It's in the Nalalu area. So I actually considered the Nalalu area. I've got two other friends who live on off-grid homesteads there. I considered the Nalalu area heavily when thinking about buying a property for my off-grid homestead. I ended up choosing another location. I only say that it's on the north shore of Lake Huron between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. It's in climate zone 4. I didn't want to do Nalalu because Nalalu is climate zone 3. So it's real boreal forest. There's no hardwoods there, right? I wanted to be in climate zone 4 where the climate's a little bit more temperate. And there's still hardwoods, there's still maple trees, there's still oak trees, though I really love those trees growing up in central and southern Ontario. So, good luck. There are some very rare unorganized townships still that are south of, call it the French River or Sudbury, North Bay areas. There are still a few, but they are not many. So we'll leave it at that there, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great resource for anybody considering building a homestead, whether on-grid or off-grid. Anyone looking for rural property in the province of Ontario, thank you so much to Adam Ruzzo. He's an amazing musician. He's an amazing folk musician. That's arguably the most impressive thing about Adam, is that he has a master's and an undergrad in music from University of Toronto. He was the lead guitarist at the hotel band at the Royal York Hotel in downtown Toronto, which is right across from Union Station, the most legendary and old hotel in the entire country. He's an amazing musician. He just has a new album out. Check him out on YouTube, on Instagram, and on TikTok. His handle is Adam Ruzzo. I believe it's Ruzzo. Adam Ruzzo Music on TikTok and YouTube. And then also check him out on TikTok. And his handle there is Cabin Speak on TikTok. And TikTok is where he shared the most amount of information about his cabin. So you can see videos of him at his cabin, his off-grid homestead that he built, as well as his music stuff. Also check out another Wild Ontario legend named Matt Steve, or Steves, I believe. So Matt Steves has a YouTube channel. He's got a number of documentaries that he's done about amazing wild Ontarians doing crazy stuff here in Ontario. And one of his videos is about Adam Ruzzo and his whole off-grid life. So check out that documentary on Adam. I believe it's about a 15-minute documentary. That's how I discovered Adam Ruzzo, was through Matt Steves, his YouTube channel. Also follow Matt Steves on Instagram. And thank you so much for watching this episode of the Wild Ontario podcast. Please consider supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/Wild Ontario. We have exclusive bonus content there, one of which is with my weekly Patreon show, which is Wild Ontario Weekly Review. I review all the stuff going on over the past week in Ontario. That's for Patreon supporters only. So you can just also support us for all the content that I put out across TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and this podcast. So that support is greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/Wild Ontario. Stay wild, stay sexy, you beautiful wild Ontarians, and see you next time. Thank you to Adam Ruzzo.